September 13th, 2006. What began as an ordinary day at Dawson College in Montreal turned into unimaginable horror when a lone gunman opened fire on innocent students. One life was lost, 19 others were scarred forever. This is not just a crime story. It's a haunting journey you can't look away from. On September 13th, 2006, Montreal awoke to an ordinary Wednesday. Dawson College, a bustling institution located at the edge of downtown, was alive with the energy of students returning to campus for the fall semester. Young people filled the hallways and cafeterias, juggling books, conversations, and the hopeful rhythm of academic life. For many, it was just another day of lectures, group study sessions, and catching up with friends between classes. No one could have predicted that by early afternoon, the campus would descend into chaos, and its name would forever be etched into Canada's history of tragedy. At approximately 12:41 p.m., the routine calm of the cafeteria was pierced by a noise that seemed foreign at first, loud, sharp, and echoing off the walls. Some students thought it might be a prank or construction nearby. But within seconds, the grim reality revealed itself. A young man dressed head to toe in black, wearing a long trench coat and heavy boots, had stepped inside with weapons drawn. He moved with unsettling determination, raising his rifle and firing into the crowd of students who sat unsuspecting at tables or queued for lunch. Screams erupted, and the cafeteria transformed instantly into a scene of terror. The shooter was Kimveer Singh Gill, a 25-year-old from Laval. For years, Gill had harbored dark thoughts, feeding them through online forums and personal writings, where he expressed resentment toward society and fascination with death. He admired past mass shooters, most notably those from Columbine, and longed for notoriety. His personal blog, posted on a website known for Gothic culture, painted a portrait of alienation, anger, and obsession. Yet few who knew him in person saw beyond the quiet young man who kept largely to himself. He had prepared meticulously for this moment, carrying multiple firearms and enough ammunition to unleash prolonged devastation. Inside the cafeteria, panic overtook reason. Students scrambled to hide under tables, shield themselves behind vending machines, or run toward the exits. Some dove through windows in desperation, crashing onto the pavement outside. Others clung to each other, paralyzed by fear, unable to process what was happening around them. The sound of gunfire echoed relentlessly, punctuated by the cries of the wounded and the frantic calls for help. Within minutes, blood stained the cafeteria floor, and dozens lay injured. Among them was Anastasia D'Souza, an 18-year-old student just beginning her studies at Dawson. Anastasia was known among her friends for her warmth and charisma, someone who embodied the optimism of youth and the promise of a bright future. She had been in the wrong place at the wrong time when Gill's bullets tore through the crowd. In moments, her life was taken, and with it, the hopes and dreams she carried into that campus. Her death would come to symbolize the senseless cruelty of the attack. Outside the walls of Dawson College, the city of Montreal was unaware of the horror unfolding. But inside, survivors described the scene as something out of a nightmare. Students huddled in classrooms, whispering in fear, while others rushed through stairwells to escape. Fire alarms blared, adding to the confusion. Instructors, equally stunned, tried to shepherd their students to safety, some barricading doors with desks and chairs. Cell phones buzzed with frantic calls to friends and family, desperate to assure loved ones or plead for help. The response from police was swift. Officers from the Service de Police de la Ville de Montréal, SPVM, were nearby, conducting patrols, when the first reports of shots fired reached them. Within minutes, armed units rushed toward the college, determined to neutralize the threat before the death toll rose further. The urgency of their actions cannot be overstated. In situations like this, every second means another life either spared or lost. As officers entered the building, Gill continued his rampage, firing with mechanical precision. He seemed to thrive on the chaos, his movements cold and deliberate. Witnesses later recalled the chilling calm with which he handled his weapons, almost as if he had rehearsed the scenario countless times in his head. Yet despite his preparation, Gil had not anticipated such a rapid police response. Within moments, heavily armed officers were inside the cafeteria, weapons drawn, shouting commands. The confrontation between Gil and the police was tense and immediate. Bullets were exchanged, shattering glass and ricocheting across the cafeteria walls. In those frantic moments, the officer's focus was singular. Stop the shooter before he could inflict more carnage. Gil was struck by police fire, wounded but still defiant. Moments later, realizing the inevitable, he turned one of his own guns on himself and ended his life. The attack that had begun with such ferocity concluded abruptly, leaving behind a haunting silence. The aftermath was overwhelming. Paramedics poured into the building, attending to the injured scattered across the cafeteria and adjoining halls. Some victims clung to life, bleeding heavily, while others endured the searing pain of bullet wounds to their limbs and torsos. For first responders, the challenge was immense. Assess injuries quickly, stabilize those who could be saved, and transport the critical cases to nearby hospitals. In total, 19 people were wounded, some with injuries so severe they required months of recovery. The cafeteria floor, once filled with chatter and laughter, was now a triage center marked by bloodstains and abandoned belongings. As news of the shooting spread across Montreal and beyond, the shock was profound. Parents rushed to the scene, frantic to find their children, their faces etched with fear as they waited for updates. For hours, the area surrounding Dawson College became a hub of emergency vehicles, flashing lights, and tearful reunions. For those whose loved ones did not emerge, the grief was immeasurable. The de Souza family, upon hearing the confirmation of Anastasia's death, entered into a grief that words could never capture. The media soon descended, broadcasting live images of students fleeing the campus, hands raised in surrender, police officers sweeping hallways, and victims being carried out on stretchers. Across Canada, viewers sat in disbelief as the story unfolded, reminded of the fragile line between safety and catastrophe. For Montreal, it was a haunting return to trauma last felt in 1989 during the École Polytechnique massacre. The parallels were undeniable. Once again, a gunman had turned an educational institution into a killing ground, leaving a nation grappling with grief and anger. Part 1 of the story closes on the chilling realization that in less than an hour, an ordinary school day had been transformed into one of Canada's darkest chapters. The gunfire had ceased, but its echoes reverberated through every corridor of Dawson College and every heart that had witnessed the horror. What remained were questions about the shooter's motives, about the systems that failed to detect his spiral, and about how a society could prevent such devastation from happening again. The gunfire had ended, but in its place came an unsettling silence that carried a different kind of weight. Outside Dawson College, crowds of students gathered in shock, their faces pale, some still trembling, others sobbing uncontrollably as they clutched phones to their ears. Sirens filled the air as ambulances, patrol cars, and media vans converged on the scene. Police cordoned off blocks surrounding the campus, securing the perimeter as investigators began piecing together what had just happened. For many, the relief of survival was instantly overshadowed by the images they could not erase. The sound of bullets striking walls, the sight of classmates collapsing, the metallic smell of blood in a space once associated with laughter and conversation. Trauma had already begun to take root. Inside the college, chaos transitioned to methodical control. First responders worked feverishly, tagging victims, stopping bleeding, and rushing the most critical to nearby hospitals. Students who had hidden in classrooms were slowly evacuated by police, their hands raised above their heads to ensure no one was mistaken for a threat. Instructors whispered reassurances, though their own voices shook with fear. The halls, once bustling, were eerily quiet, broken only by the occasional sob or the hurried footsteps of emergency personnel. The cafeteria itself was now a crime scene, frozen in time. Overturned chairs, backpacks abandoned in haste, shattered glass, and the lifeless body of the shooter slumped on the floor. At the hospitals, families gathered in waiting rooms, desperate for news. For some, the updates brought cautious relief. A loved one would survive, though recovery would be long. For others, the reality was crushing. When word spread that 18-year-old Anastasia D'Souza had not survived, the grief radiated far beyond her family. Anastasia had been, by all accounts, a bright presence, charismatic, ambitious, and full of life. Friends spoke of her laughter, her kindness, and her dreams for the future. Her death instantly became the human face of the tragedy, a reminder of the fragility of life and the cruelty of its loss. Her mother, Louise D'Souza, appeared in the days following the shooting, her sorrow impossible to contain. Yet her voice became a call for healing and awareness, symbolizing the collective grief of a shaken community. As details about the shooter emerged, the portrait of Kimveer Singh Gill became clearer. Investigators searched his home in Laval, uncovering a cache of weapons, ammunition, and writings that pointed to his obsession with death and violence. His online blog revealed chilling entries where he glorified previous school shootings and described his disdain for society. He spoke of loneliness, bitterness, and the allure of notoriety. He listed himself as a fan of violent video games, heavy metal music, and weapons. The writings were not cries for help in the traditional sense. They were manifestos of anger, pieces of a puzzle that suggested his attack had been long in the making. To many, it raised a troubling question. How could such clear signs of darkness go unnoticed until it was too late? Survivors began recounting their experiences to investigators and media. Their testimonies painted a vivid picture of terror. The deafening shots, the scramble for cover, the desperate dash for the exits. Some remembered Gill's expression, calm, detached, almost mechanical, as he fired into the crowd. Others spoke of bravery amid the chaos. Students pulling friends to safety, strangers comforting the injured, teachers refusing to leave their students behind. One young woman recalled hiding under a table, her heart pounding so loudly she feared it would give her away, while beside her a classmate bled profusely from a gunshot wound. These stories became part of the collective memory, illustrating both the horror and the resilience that emerged from the darkest moments. The police officers who had entered the cafeteria became instant heroes. Constables Dennis Cote and Alain Diallo, among the first to confront Gill, described their encounter with restraint. They emphasized their training, their focus on neutralizing the threat, and the split-second decisions that had to be made. Though their bullets struck Gill, it was his final act of suicide that ended the standoff. Yet their intervention had undeniably saved countless lives. Officials later confirmed that had Gill been left unchecked for even a few more minutes, the death toll could have been catastrophic. In the days following the shooting, Montreal was enveloped in mourning. Vigils were held, with students gathering on campus lawns, lighting candles, and leaving flowers in honor of Anastasia and the injured. The city's collective grief was palpable, echoing the sorrow felt years earlier during the École Polytechnique massacre. Leaders, including Quebec's premier and Canada's prime minister, addressed the tragedy, offering condolences and pledging support. But beyond words of sympathy came calls for action, demands to examine how someone like Gill could so easily obtain firearms and carry them onto a college campus. Gun control quickly became the central issue. Gill's weapons were legally registered, reigniting debates about Canada's firearm registry system, which had long been contentious. Advocates argued that stricter measures were necessary to prevent such attacks, while opponents countered that registries could not prevent determined individuals from committing violence. For families of victims, the debate was deeply personal. To them, the existence of legal loopholes was not abstract policy. It was the difference between life and death. Mental health also became a focal point. Gill's writings made it clear he had struggled with feelings of alienation and hatred, yet he had never sought professional help. Experts began discussing the warning signs, urging society to pay closer attention to individuals expressing violent ideologies online. Educators called for increased resources on campuses for mental health support and crisis intervention, recognizing that colleges and universities were not immune from such tragedies. For Dawson College itself, the path forward was fraught with difficulty. The campus closed for several days as investigators processed the crime scene. When students finally returned, the atmosphere was heavy with unease. Hallways felt different. Classrooms carried invisible scars, and the cafeteria remained off-limits, a place too charged with trauma to resume its former purpose. Counseling services were offered, and many students sought therapy to cope with nightmares, flashbacks, and survivor's guilt. Professors adjusted coursework, understanding that education could not resume as if nothing had happened. The story of Dawson College was no longer confined to Montreal. It became an international headline, joining the grim list of global school shootings. Analysts compared it to Columbine, highlighting the disturbing similarities in the shooter's motivations and methods. For Canadians, it was a wake-up call, a reminder that such violence was not confined to the United States but could erupt in their own cities, on their own campuses, among their own children. As time passed, the resilience of the survivors began to shine through. Some of those injured made remarkable recoveries, though not without visible scars and lasting trauma. Others struggled quietly, their emotional wounds harder to heal than the physical ones. Several students channeled their pain into advocacy, speaking publicly about the need for stricter gun laws and more accessible mental health care. Anastasia's friends organized memorials and scholarships in her name, determined that her life would be remembered not only for how it ended, but for the light she brought into the world. Part 2 ends on a community grappling with grief, resilience, and pressing questions. Dawson College was forever altered, but its students and faculty, though broken in many ways, stood together in solidarity. The shooter's life had ended on the cafeteria floor, but the echoes of his actions reverberated across the country, sparking debates that would continue for years. The story was no longer just about a single act of violence. It was about the fragility of safety, the gaps in systems meant to protect, and the strength of a community forced to confront tragedy head-on. Months turned into years, but the memory of September 13, 2006 never left those who had walked the halls of Dawson College or the families who had lost so much that day. For survivors, the shooting was not a single event contained within the hours it unfolded. It was a shadow that stretched into their daily lives, resurfacing in unexpected ways. The sound of a door slamming shut could trigger panic. Crowded spaces felt suffocating. Some carried scars on their bodies as permanent reminders of the bullets they had survived, while others bore invisible wounds in the form of anxiety, depression, or recurring nightmares. The process of healing was uneven, and for many, incomplete. Trauma became an unwelcome companion, demanding to be acknowledged even as they tried to reclaim normalcy. The community around Dawson College worked tirelessly to transform the site of horror into a place of resilience. Vigils and memorials continued, and every September, flowers appeared on the campus in remembrance of Anastasia de Souza. The school itself underwent changes, investing in counseling services and security measures, while faculty members adjusted their roles to become not only educators but also pillars of emotional support. For many students, the return to classrooms was an act of courage, a refusal to let violence define the remainder of their education. Yet even with these efforts, the cafeteria where the shooting had occurred remained an emotional scar, a place many could not bring themselves to enter without unease. The de Souza family carried the heaviest burden. Anastasia's absence was a wound that time could not mend. Her parents, Louise and Nelson, faced each day with the knowledge that their daughter's life had been stolen in an act of senseless violence. Yet, out of their grief, they sought to create meaning. They spoke publicly about the need for awareness, compassion, and stricter measures to prevent tragedies like Dawson. Louise, in particular, became a voice for other grieving families, showing remarkable strength in the midst of unimaginable loss. In interviews, she emphasized not only her daughter's tragic death, but also the joy Anastasia had brought to those around her, ensuring her memory was not reduced to a statistic in a story of violence. Nationally, the Dawson College shooting reignited debates on gun control in Canada. Gill's firearms had been legally obtained and registered, raising alarm over the effectiveness of the country's existing laws. The federal gun registry, already a point of political contention, faced renewed scrutiny. Advocates for stricter laws argued that the tragedy highlighted the dangers of allowing easy access to semi-automatic weapons, while opponents continued to challenge the registry's cost and efficiency. Families of victims, however, framed the issue in stark human terms. For them, the debate was not about policy spreadsheets or political rhetoric. It was about lives cut short and futures stolen. Their advocacy added urgency to the national conversation, forcing leaders to confront the consequences of inaction. The tragedy also exposed the growing role of the internet in shaping violent ideologies. Gill's online writings, filled with admiration for Columbine and dark musings about death, became a case study in how communities of isolation and anger can thrive in virtual spaces. Experts in psychology and criminology warned that similar patterns could emerge again if society failed to monitor such signals more closely. Colleges and universities across the country began exploring ways to identify students in crisis, investing in early intervention programs and mental health resources. Yet even as awareness increased, there remained the uncomfortable truth that predicting violence is nearly impossible, and prevention requires vigilance on multiple fronts. In the years following Dawson, survivors found different paths to healing. Some avoided speaking about the event altogether, choosing silence as a way to cope. Others stepped into the public eye, sharing their stories to ensure the lessons of that day were not forgotten. One survivor who had been critically injured used his recovery journey to highlight the resilience of the human spirit, appearing at conferences to advocate for stricter gun laws. Another survivor described how she transformed her trauma into motivation to pursue a career in psychology, determined to help others cope with experiences of violence and loss. These personal narratives reminded the country that behind the headlines and statistics were individuals whose lives had been profoundly altered but who continued to push forward. Dawson College itself became a symbol of both tragedy and resilience. In the aftermath, the institution introduced the Peace Garden, a memorial space designed to honor Anastasia and all those affected. The garden was not meant to be a site of mourning alone, but also a place of reflection, a physical representation of the community's resilience and commitment to healing. Every year, ceremonies brought together students, faculty, and families, creating a ritual of remembrance that ensured the tragedy was never erased from collective memory. The broader city of Montreal carried the wound as well. For many, the shooting stirred painful memories of the École Polytechnique massacre in 1989, another moment when gun violence tore through the illusion of safety within an educational institution. The recurrence of such an event reinforced the vulnerability of public spaces and the need for ongoing dialogue about prevention. It also forged a sense of solidarity, as survivors and families from both tragedies found common ground in their grief and advocacy. The city, known for its vibrancy and cultural richness, was reminded that beneath its surface existed vulnerabilities shared by every modern society. Over time, the shooter himself faded from public memory, his name mentioned less frequently in order to deny him the notoriety he had once sought. Instead, the narrative shifted to those whose lives he had impacted, the victims, the survivors, and the families who carried their grief with dignity. The media, community leaders, and Dawson College itself made a conscious choice to elevate stories of resilience over those of hatred. This collective decision underscored a broader truth, that evil thrives on recognition, but memory can be shaped to honor those who were lost instead of those who caused the loss. The Dawson College shooting remains a chapter in Canada's history that cannot be undone. Its lessons are painful but necessary. The need for vigilance in identifying individuals at risk of violence, the importance of strict firearm regulations, and the recognition that mental health must be prioritized in communities and institutions. More than that, it is a reminder of the fragility of ordinary days, how quickly routine can collapse into chaos, and how acts of violence leave echoes that last far beyond the moment of impact. For the students who lived through it, life was permanently divided into before and after. Before the shooting, Dawson was a place of education, friendship, and youth. After, it became a place marked by trauma but also by the strength to endure. The survivors' ability to rebuild their lives, the family's courage to advocate for change, and the city's determination to remember rather than forget all form part of the story's legacy. It is a legacy written not only in grief but also in resilience, one that ensures the events of September 13, 2006 continue to resonate as a warning, a lesson, and a tribute. Part 3 closes the story not with resolution, for the wounds of Dawson cannot be fully healed, but with a testament to survival. The gunfire may have stopped, but its echoes shaped a generation of students, families, and citizens. Through remembrance, advocacy, and resilience, they ensured that the tragedy was not the end of their story, but the beginning of a continued effort to build a safer and more compassionate society. On a quiet morning in Roseburg, Oregon, the sound of gunfire shattered a college campus, leaving 9 lives lost and a community forever scarred. What unfolded inside that classroom was terror, courage, and tragedy intertwined. A story so haunting, you'll want to stay until the very end. The town of Roseburg, Oregon, was the kind of place where life seemed to move at a gentler pace. Nestled among green valleys and rolling hills, the community thrived on its sense of safety and neighborly spirit. For locals, Umpqua Community College represented opportunity, growth, and hope. Many of its students were the first in their families to attend college, and for others it was a place to begin anew after hardships. On the morning of October 1, 2015, students arrived with backpacks slung over their shoulders, their laughter mixing with the crisp fall air. Nothing about that Thursday hinted at the horror waiting just hours ahead. By 10:30 a.m., the classrooms were alive with routine. Inside Snyder Hall, English professor Lawrence Levine prepared to lead another discussion. Levine, 67, was known for his calm demeanor and genuine care for students. He was nearing retirement, yet he still found purpose in nurturing young minds. For those who walked into his classroom that day, he was more than a professor. He was a mentor, a patient guide through the complexities of literature and language. Among his students sat a blend of dreamers, strivers, and those simply trying to carve out their place in the world. At the same time, another man prepared himself just outside that very building. Christopher Harper Mercer, 26 years old, carried with him an arsenal of firearms and hundreds of rounds of ammunition. His face was set with grim determination. To him, this was not a school. It was a stage. Isolated for much of his life, he had grown increasingly obsessed with violence, nurturing dark thoughts in the shadows of his quiet existence. He lived with his mother, who shared his enthusiasm for guns and shooting ranges, though she remained unaware of the storm building within him. On that morning, Harper Mercer dressed in black clothing and body armor, his movements deliberate as he approached Snyder Hall. The students inside remained unaware of the danger. Trevin Ansbach, a 20-year-old athlete and aspiring firefighter, exchanged quiet words with classmates. Known for his leadership and optimism, he carried himself with the confidence of youth. Nearby sat Lucero Alcaraz, 19, one of the first in her family to pursue higher education. Her dream was to become a pediatric nurse, a path inspired by her compassion and love for children. Quinn Cooper, only 18 and just 4 days into his college journey, nervously adjusted his notes. His family had celebrated his first week, filled with excitement for the doors education might open. Each student carried hopes that extended far beyond that classroom. At 10:38 a.m., the first shot rang out. The sharp crack of a gunshot tore through the stillness, echoing down the hall. Confusion quickly turned into chaos. Students ducked, screamed, and scrambled for safety. The gunman had entered. Witnesses later recalled his cold, calculated manner. He commanded the room, his voice steady as he forced students to stand, asking them about their faith. Some begged for their lives, others froze in fear, but Harper Mercer showed no mercy. He pulled the trigger again and again, the sound reverberating through the walls, carrying terror into every corner of the campus. Within minutes, lives were stolen. Professor Levine, standing at the front, became one of the first victims, unable to shield his students from the carnage. Trevin Ansbach, the athlete with a promising future, fell next, his young life extinguished before it could truly begin. Around him, classmates faced similar fates. Lucas Eibel, 18, a dedicated chemistry student and volunteer, collapsed beside friends. Jason Johnson, 33, who had rebuilt his life after battling addiction, was cut down just as he embraced a new chapter. Kim Dietz, 59, attending classes alongside her daughter, never made it out alive. Serena Dawn Moore, 44, who loved animals deeply, also lost her life in that room. Rebecca Carnes, just 18, eager to prove herself in medical technology, saw her ambitions vanish in an instant. The classroom, once filled with youthful chatter, became a place of unimaginable loss. Amid the bloodshed, one man rose in defiance. Chris Mintz, a 30-year-old Army veteran, heard the shots and ran toward danger. He tried to block Harper Mercer's path, refusing to let him continue his killing spree. The veteran shouted warnings to others, urging them to flee. Harper Mercer responded with cold brutality, shooting Mintz multiple times. Bullets tore into his legs and torso, but even as he fell, Mintz refused to reveal where survivors were hiding. His courage that day saved lives, though it nearly cost him his own. As the shots echoed, frantic calls flooded emergency dispatchers. Police units raced toward the campus, sirens wailing across Roseburg. For residents, disbelief spread like wildfire. A mass shooting here, in their quiet town, was unthinkable. Officers rushed into Snyder Hall within minutes, weapons drawn, hearts pounding as they advanced toward the sound of gunfire. Inside, Harper Mercer found himself cornered. A brief exchange of gunfire erupted between him and the police. Realizing his plan was collapsing, he retreated into the classroom. Moments later, a final shot rang out, not at another victim, but at himself. The shooter had ended his own life. The rampage was over, though the devastation it left behind had only begun to sink in. For those who survived, the minutes of terror felt like an eternity. Students clung to each other, sobbing as officers led them out of the building. Parents rushed to the campus, desperate for news of their children. The parking lot became a place of reunions for some and heartbreak for others. Roseburg, a town that prided itself on safety, was now etched into America's growing list of mass shooting sites. In the hours that followed, investigators worked swiftly to secure the scene. Families waited for names, their worst fears confirmed one by one. Vigils soon filled the night, candles casting soft glows against the darkness as the community gathered to mourn. 9 lives were gone, each representing unfulfilled dreams and broken families. For Roseburg, the horror of that morning would never be forgotten. The hours after the shooting unfolded like a nightmare that refused to end. As investigators poured into Umpqua Community College, Snyder Hall stood silent, its walls marked with the echoes of gunfire and the weight of sorrow. Yellow tape cordoned off the campus while first responders moved carefully, documenting the scene with photographs, marking evidence, and collecting the weapons Harper Mercer had brought with him. 9 victims had already been confirmed dead, their names slowly released to the public. Each name carried with it a story, and each story carried unbearable grief for the families who waited anxiously nearby. The community of Roseburg was small enough that tragedy felt personal to everyone. Strangers comforted strangers, neighbors wept together, and vigils sprung up across town by nightfall. At the local high school football field, hundreds gathered, holding candles that flickered against the cool October air. Prayers were whispered, songs were sung, and names were read aloud, each pause heavy with meaning. Parents clutched photos of their children, their faces lit by trembling candlelight. For them, this wasn't just another mass shooting that people watched on television. This was their town, their college, their loved ones. The grief was raw, immediate, and permanent. In homes across the country, television screens broadcast the story. Images of Roseburg filled the airwaves as reporters camped outside the campus and hospitals. President Barack Obama addressed the tragedy from the White House, his words heavy with frustration. He spoke not only of grief but of the cycle of violence that had become all too familiar in America. His tone was weary, almost resigned, as he acknowledged the painful reality. After each shooting came mourning, then debate, then silence, until the next tragedy struck. For the families in Roseburg, those words offered little comfort, but they were a recognition of the profound loss that had been inflicted on their town. As the investigation unfolded, more details about Harper Mercer's life came to light. He had grown up isolated, struggling to connect with others, often withdrawing into a world of video games, online forums, and dark thoughts. His writings revealed resentment and anger toward society, particularly those who found success, love, or faith that he could not achieve. He saw himself as an outsider, invisible and ignored, and in his twisted view, the shooting would make the world notice him. At his apartment, police discovered a cache of firearms, journals, and evidence of meticulous planning. His mother, Laurel Harper, became a subject of scrutiny. She had shared her son's love of guns, practicing at shooting ranges with him, and though she knew of his struggles with Asperger's syndrome and depression, she resisted seeking deeper intervention. She defended his right to bear arms, even as his mental state deteriorated. While investigators pieced together Harper Mercer's path to violence, survivors of the shooting struggled with their own recovery. Chris Mintz, the Army veteran hailed as a hero, lay in a hospital bed after enduring multiple surgeries. Shot 7 times, his legs broken, he recounted how he had pleaded with the gunman to spare others. His story spread across the nation, hailed as an act of selfless courage. Yet Mintz himself felt conflicted. For him, the price had been steep, and though he had lived, the physical and emotional scars would remain. Other survivors carried quieter burdens. Students who had crouched beneath desks or hidden in hallways relived the trauma with every loud noise. Many refused to return to the campus, haunted by the memories of that day. Counselors flooded into Roseburg, offering therapy and support groups, but healing was a slow process. The small town was not accustomed to trauma of this scale, and its residents were forced to navigate the difficult path of grief and survival together. Funerals began one after another. Churches overflowed with mourners. Eulogies painted vivid pictures of lives cut short. Lucero Alcaraz's laughter, Quinn Cooper's love for dancing, Jason Johnson's determination to rebuild, Kim Dietz's devotion to her family. Each service was a reminder of what had been stolen. Each coffin a symbol of dreams that would never be realized. For parents, siblings, and friends, grief was compounded by anger. The question on everyone's lips was the same. Why here? Why us? Law enforcement's role didn't end with securing the scene. Sheriff John Hanlon became the face of the investigation, standing in front of cameras, offering updates while carefully choosing his words. He refused to publicly name Harper Mercer in press briefings, insisting that the shooter did not deserve notoriety. For Hanlon, the focus belonged on the victims and survivors, not the man who had inflicted the pain. His firm stance earned both praise and criticism, but for many in Roseburg, it was a way of reclaiming dignity from a man who sought to dominate the headlines. As days turned into weeks, the story of Umpqua Community College joined a long list of tragedies marked by mass shootings across America. Yet for those in Roseburg, it was not just another incident. It was their community that had been shattered, their friends who had been buried, their innocence that had been lost. The campus reopened slowly, with flowers and photographs placed outside Snyder Hall, a memorial that grew with each passing day. Students and faculty returned with heavy hearts, determined not to let the violence define the institution they loved. Behind closed doors, investigators compiled timelines and examined evidence, but the answers they sought were unsatisfying. There was no grand conspiracy, no external cause, only a troubled young man with access to deadly weapons and a plan fueled by resentment. For many, this realization was harder to accept than any other. It meant that nothing extraordinary had brought the horror to Roseburg. It was simply the result of an ordinary man's decision to act on his darkest thoughts. The scars extended beyond families and survivors. First responders who entered Snyder Hall carried their own nightmares. Officers who confronted Harper Mercer struggled with the images they had witnessed. Blood on the floors, silence where there had once been voices, and the lifeless bodies of students who only minutes before had been discussing literature. For them, duty had demanded composure, but the emotional toll lingered long after the crime scene was cleared. The town's grief became part of its identity. Roseburg was no longer just a quiet Oregon community. It was now the site of one of America's mass shootings, its name etched alongside Columbine, Virginia Tech, and Sandy Hook. Yet within the sorrow came resilience. Neighbors organized fundraisers for victims' families. Strangers sent cards and letters of support from across the country. and community leaders urged healing and unity. Though broken, Roseburg was determined not to be defined solely by tragedy. As the first month passed, the shock softened into a steady ache. For some, the pain was too great to bear. For others, resilience became their way forward. The college community clung to one another, professors supporting students comforting one another, as they attempted to move on with lives that had been irreversibly changed. In those moments of collective strength, Roseburg began to write the next chapter of its story, not of violence, but of endurance in the face of it. Time did not erase the pain of October 1st, 2015. In Roseburg, the memory of that Thursday morning remained as vivid as the sound of gunfire that had once ripped through Snyder Hall. The victims' faces appeared in framed photographs on mantels, their names whispered in conversations, their absence felt at every gathering. For the families left behind, each holiday, each birthday, became a reminder of what had been stolen. 9 lives were cut short in mere minutes, yet the ripples of their loss stretched endlessly. Parents who once celebrated their children's college dreams were left with silence. Siblings who once shared laughter now carried grief. Spouses and friends who had planned futures together faced the cruel finality of goodbye. In the months that followed, Roseburg worked to rebuild, but healing was never simple. Students returned to Umpqua Community College, passing Snyder Hall with heavy hearts. Some avoided it altogether, unable to step foot in the building that had been transformed from a classroom into a crime scene. Memorials grew on campus, walls covered with flowers, letters, and photographs left by those who mourned. Walking past them meant facing the memory of the victims, each tribute telling a story of love and loss. For survivors, the campus no longer represented opportunity alone. It became a place where trauma and resilience coexisted. Nationally, the tragedy sparked renewed debates. Politicians clashed over gun laws, mental health funding, and campus security. President Barack Obama's impassioned speech following the shooting was replayed countless times. His frustration was clear, his words sharp, as he urged Americans not to accept mass shootings as a normal part of life. Yet, as with tragedies before and after, change came slowly, tangled in politics and public division. For Roseburg, those debates were far removed from the immediate reality of grief. While the nation argued, the town buried its children. Amid the sorrow, acts of humanity shone through. Fundraisers were organized to help families with funeral costs. Strangers from across the country sent cards and letters, filling mailboxes with messages of compassion. Survivors like Chris Mintz became symbols of bravery, their stories inspiring countless others. Mintz himself struggled through painful rehabilitation, learning to walk again after the bullets shattered his legs. His courage, however, went beyond physical recovery. In interviews, he spoke softly about the lives lost, redirecting attention to the victims rather than his own heroism. His words reflected the collective spirit of Roseburg, that the memory of those who died must remain at the center of the story. For those who had been inside Snyder Hall, the journey of healing was personal and often invisible. Nightmares haunted their sleep, sudden noises triggered panic, and guilt gnawed at survivors who had made it out alive while friends had not. Counseling centers became lifelines, offering therapy and group sessions where survivors could speak their pain aloud. In those rooms, voices cracked, tears flowed, and silence lingered between words. Healing was not linear. Some found strength in speaking out, while others withdrew, carrying their scars quietly. Years passed, but anniversaries returned each autumn, reopening wounds that had never fully closed. On October 1st each year, the community gathered in solemn remembrance. Bells tolled, candles flickered, and names were read aloud, their echoes carried by the Oregon wind. Parents stood with tears in their eyes as the town vowed again never to forget. For younger students who enrolled at UCC after the tragedy, these memorials served as reminders of the resilience that defined the campus. The college, though marked by grief, refused to let violence erase its mission of education and hope. The victims' stories continued to inspire long after their deaths. Scholarships were created in their names, ensuring that future students could pursue the dreams that had been stolen. Families spoke publicly about their children, not as victims defined by tragedy, but as individuals defined by their passions. Trevin Anspach's dedication to sports and firefighting, Lucero Alcaraz's compassion for children, Quinn Cooper's joyful spirit, Lucas Eibel's devotion to science, Jason Johnson's determination to start anew, Kim Dietz's warmth and loyalty, Serena Moore's love of animals, and Rebecca Carnes's bright ambition. Each life, though cut short, became a legacy that pushed others to strive harder, love deeper, and appreciate the fragility of time. For law enforcement, the tragedy left an indelible mark. Officers who had rushed into Snyder Hall carried memories they could not shake. The chaos, the carnage, the silence afterward. Many struggled privately with trauma, replaying the scene in their minds, haunted by the faces of those they could not save. Sheriff John Hanlon, who had stood before cameras and refused to speak the shooter's name, carried the responsibility of representing his community while grappling with his own sorrow. Behind his stern exterior was a man deeply aware of the scars left behind, not only on the victims' families, but also on the responders who bore witness. The name Christopher Harper Mercer faded from the headlines as the community insisted on focusing on the victims. His story, though dissected by investigators, was not allowed to overshadow those he had harmed. The public learned of his isolation, his obsession with guns, his resentment toward others, and his final act of violence. Yet Roseburg refused to let him be remembered as anything more than the man who tried to shatter their peace. Their focus was on resilience, on the light that endured in spite of his darkness. As time stretched forward, the story of Umpqua Community College became part of the broader narrative of American mass shootings, a grim list that grew longer each year. Yet for those who lived it, this was never just another tragedy. It was the day their friends, children, and teachers were taken. It was the day their sense of safety was forever broken. It was the day they learned that even the quietest towns are not immune to violence. Still, amid grief, the community chose to honor life rather than dwell in despair. Roseburg became a symbol not of tragedy alone, but of strength. The survivors who walked back into classrooms, the parents who told their children stories, the neighbors who held one another through the nights of sorrow. These were the true legacies of October 1st. The candles that burned at vigils did not fade when the flame was extinguished. They lived on in the determination of a town that refused to be defined solely by loss. The final memory of that day is not only the gunfire or the chaos, but also the image of a community standing together in the aftermath. In the quiet that followed the storm, Roseburg found its voice in unity, grief, and remembrance. The shooting at Umpqua Community College was a tragedy of immeasurable pain, but the resilience that followed told another story, a story of humanity's ability to endure even in the face of its darkest moments. And though the victims were gone, their names continued to be spoken, their dreams carried forward, and their legacy preserved in the hearts of all who remembered them. A quiet English village, a beloved teacher, and a charming young theology student. Behind closed doors, a sinister plot was unfolding. What looked like love was actually manipulation, betrayal, and murder. This is the shocking story of Peter Farquhar, and the killer who deceived an entire community. On the quiet lanes of Maids Moreton, a picturesque village in Buckinghamshire, life moved at a gentle rhythm. The stone cottages, ancient church, and the close-knit community gave the area the aura of timeless English charm. It was here, in October 2015, that the sudden death of 69-year-old Peter Farquhar was reported. To those who knew him, the explanation seemed straightforward. He had been in fragile health, a man who struggled with bouts of drinking and the natural decline of age. His passing was mourned deeply but accepted as part of life's inevitable course. Yet behind the curtain of grief and whispered condolences, the story of his death was only beginning to unravel. Peter Farquhar was not just another resident of Maids Moreton. He was a man who had left an indelible mark on generations of students. As an English teacher at Manchester Grammar School and later at the prestigious Stowe School, he had built a reputation for intellectual rigor, kindness, and a passion for literature. His students remembered him not only for his lessons in Shakespeare and poetry but for his ability to inspire thought and ambition. Beyond the classroom, He had also pursued writing, authoring novels that revealed his reflective and deeply spiritual nature. Those who met him saw a man of principle, anchored by faith and yet shaped by the struggles of living as a gay man who had only found the courage to openly embrace his identity late in life. In 2011, Peter met Ben Field, a theology student from the nearby University of Buckingham. Charismatic, intelligent, and seemingly devout, Ben had an aura that drew people in. He presented himself as a serious young man with a passion for literature, faith, and intellectual pursuits, interests that resonated with Peter's own. Despite the age gap of nearly 50 years, their bond grew quickly. For Peter, it was a chance at companionship in his later years, someone to share his faith, his writing, and his home. For Ben, however, the relationship masked a chillingly calculated plan. Ben Field was not what he seemed. To Peter's friends and members of their church community, Ben appeared devoted and attentive, the young man who moved into Peter's house to support him, offering company and care. But underneath the facade was manipulation of the darkest kind. Together with his friend Martin Smith, an aspiring magician and playwright, Ben concocted a scheme that targeted elderly, wealthy, or vulnerable individuals. The goal was simple: infiltrate their lives, exploit their vulnerabilities, and ultimately secure financial gain through wills and estates. Peter was the first and most significant target. Once Ben moved into Peter's home, his influence became pervasive. He subtly began to control Peter's daily life, what he ate, what he drank, and even what he believed about his own health. Using his knowledge of medication and access to drugs, Ben began secretly administering sedatives and hallucinogens to Peter. The effects were devastating. A man once so articulate and clear in thought began to appear confused, paranoid, and forgetful. To friends, these changes were explained as the natural consequence of aging and perhaps excessive drinking. But privately, Peter felt something far more insidious was happening to him. His journals, which would later become crucial evidence, revealed a man plagued with anxiety and torment. He wrote of strange lapses in memory, of feelings of detachment from reality, and of a sense that he was losing control of his mind. A devout Christian, Peter interpreted some of these experiences through a spiritual lens, worrying that he was failing morally or spiritually. Ben, exploiting this vulnerability, reinforced these fears, gaslighting him into believing he was indeed deteriorating. The manipulation was both chemical and psychological, a web designed to isolate Peter from clarity and independence. At the same time, Ben carefully cultivated affection and trust. He positioned himself as a loving partner, someone who genuinely cared for Peter's well-being. He attended church by his side, engaged in deep discussions about faith, and appeared to give Peter the companionship he had longed for. This duality, the caring lover in public and the poisoner in private, was what made Ben so convincing to those around them. The community of Maids Moreton saw only devotion, not deception. Over the years of living together, Ben's influence grew stronger. He persuaded Peter to alter his will, ensuring that he would inherit significant portions of his estate. This was presented as a natural decision in the context of their relationship, one partner ensuring the other would be cared for after death. But Peter's writings suggested he had doubts. He questioned Ben's sincerity at times, noting moments when his words and actions seemed cold, calculated, or lacking genuine affection. Still, Peter, who craved love and companionship, suppressed these concerns, choosing to believe in the image Ben presented. By late 2015, Peter's decline was stark. Friends noticed how frail he had become, how erratic his behavior sometimes appeared. He seemed weaker, more isolated, and increasingly dependent on Ben. On October 26, 2015, the inevitable happened. Peter was found dead in his home. To the outside world, the cause seemed natural. An elderly man, already frail, who drank too much and succumbed quietly in his home. His death certificate made no mention of foul play. The village mourned, his former students and colleagues paid tribute, and Ben Field, the grieving partner, played his role flawlessly. At Peter's funeral, Ben was seen as the devoted young man who had sacrificed much to care for his older lover. He gave the impression of someone deeply bereaved, further embedding the belief that his love had been genuine. Few questioned the circumstances of Peter's death. After all, no one wanted to tarnish the memory of a beloved teacher with suspicion. For a time, it seemed that Ben Field's plan had succeeded entirely. He had inherited money, property, and sympathy. He had convinced not only Peter but an entire community of his innocence. But the truth was far from buried. Peter Farquhar's death was not the closing of a chapter, but the opening act of a darker story. For while the village moved on from its grief, Ben was already seeking his next target. And it would be the strange, troubling patterns that emerged with another elderly neighbor, and more Martin, that would eventually bring investigators back to the life and death of Peter Farquhar. In the months following Peter Farquhar's death, the village of Maids Moreton returned to its familiar rhythm. For most, the passing of the well-loved teacher was a sorrowful but natural conclusion to an honorable life. To Ben Field, however, it marked both a victory and a stepping stone. He had secured financial benefit from Peter's will, consolidated his reputation as a devoted carer, and gained the trust of a community that saw him as a young man of faith and kindness. Yet for someone like Ben, who thrived on manipulation and control, one victory was never enough. His gaze soon shifted to another target, one just a few doors away, and more Martin, and was an 83-year-old retired headmistress, a devout Catholic, and a woman whose life was largely solitary but rooted in the traditions of her faith. She lived only 2 doors down from Peter's home, making her an accessible target. Like Peter, she was intelligent, articulate, and respected within the community. But she was also vulnerable, lonely, advanced in age, and yearning for companionship. Ben saw in her the same opportunities he had exploited in Peter. Someone he could charm, isolate, and manipulate into leaving him wealth and property. This time, however, his methods would evolve in a disturbing new direction. Where with Peter he had primarily relied on drugs, gaslighting, and the guise of romance, with Anne he took a more spiritual and psychological approach. He understood that Anne's faith was central to her identity, so he wove his manipulation into the fabric of her religious devotion. He visited her often, offering help with errands, companionship, and flattering words. He played the role of a caring young man guided by Christian values. For Anne, his attention was flattering and unexpected. She confided in him, welcomed his presence, and began to see him as a source of comfort in her later years. Then came the extraordinary tactic that revealed both his cunning and his cruelty. Ben began writing messages on mirrors in Anne's home, presenting them as divine revelations. These messages suggested that God wanted her to leave her estate to Ben, framing his manipulation as a holy command. For a woman of strong Catholic faith, these apparent signs carried deep weight. The messages shook her, confused her, and eventually influenced her decisions about her will. What might have seemed preposterous to others became a spiritual dilemma for Anne, who truly believed she might be acting in accordance with divine instruction. Martin Smith, Ben's close friend and co-conspirator, lingered in the background of this manipulation. Though less directly involved than Ben, he shared in the deception, presenting himself as part of the supportive circle around Anne. Together, the two young men projected an image of care and companionship. But behind the smiles and Sunday visits lay the same cold ambition that had ended Peter's life. Yet Anne was not Peter. Though deeply influenced by Ben's psychological tactics, she did not succumb to the same fate. Over time, she confided in relatives and friends about the unusual messages and Ben's growing involvement in her life. Her loved ones began to suspect that something was wrong, that his influence was not as benevolent as it appeared. The alarm bells began to sound, faintly at first, but loud enough that they would eventually catch the attention of authorities. Meanwhile, Ben maintained his double life. To Anne and the church community, he was the attentive helper, a young man guided by compassion and faith. To his accomplice Martin, he was the mastermind of a cruel game, someone who took pleasure in the act of manipulation itself. He even kept diaries in which he recorded his actions and thoughts with chilling detachment. In them, he described Peter's decline, his own success in deceiving others, and his ongoing plans with Anne. The writings were not confessions in the conventional sense. but they revealed a man who saw himself as a puppeteer, orchestrating the fates of those around him. It was through Anne's survival that the facade finally began to crack. Her relatives, alarmed by her stories and suspicious of the unusual changes in her will, raised concerns that eventually reached the police. What began as an inquiry into possible fraud soon widened into a far more complex investigation. Detectives started to piece together a pattern. Two elderly individuals, living in close proximity, both with sudden or unusual changes to their wills, both under the influence of the same young man. The coincidences were too stark to ignore. As police delved deeper, they discovered the extent of Ben's psychological hold over both Peter and Anne. They examined the mirror messages, the altered wills, and the testimony of those who had seen Anne's distress. What truly began to unravel the case, however, was the decision to re-examine the circumstances of Peter Farquhar's death. Though initially recorded as natural, the suspicions around and made investigators question whether Peter's passing had in fact been orchestrated. Peter's body was exhumed, and forensic experts conducted detailed examinations. Though the traces of the drugs used were subtle and difficult to detect after years, the circumstantial evidence was overwhelming when combined with Peter's journals and Ben's own writings. The pattern of drugging, the manipulation of his faith, and the will changes all pointed to something far darker than natural causes. The death that had been mourned quietly in 2015 now stood as the centerpiece of a murder inquiry. As detectives built their case, they uncovered a chilling portrait of Ben Field. To the public, he was articulate, intelligent, and outwardly pious. To those he targeted, he was a source of affection and companionship. But in reality, he was driven by greed, ego, and a perverse thrill in controlling the lives of others. The duality of his character made him both dangerous and convincing. It explained why Peter, a man so wise and experienced, had fallen under his spell, and why Anne, strong in faith and principle, had nearly succumbed as well. For the community of Maids Moreton, the revelations were deeply unsettling. A village that had once mourned a respected teacher now faced the possibility that his death had been a calculated murder. A young man they had embraced as one of their own stood accused of preying on their most vulnerable, but the truth was far from buried. Peter Farquhar's death was not the closing of a chapter, but the opening act of a darker story. For while the village moved on from its grief, Ben was already seeking his next target. And it would be the strange, troubling patterns that emerged with another elderly neighbor, and more Martin, that would eventually bring investigators back to the life and death of Peter Farquhar. In the months following Peter Farquhar's death, the village of Maids Moreton returned to its familiar rhythm. For most, the passing of the well-loved teacher was a sorrowful but natural conclusion to an honorable life. To Ben Field, however, it marked both a victory and a stepping stone. He had secured financial benefit from Peter's will, consolidated his reputation as a devoted carer, and gained the trust of a community that saw him as a young man of faith and kindness. Yet for someone like Ben, who thrived on manipulation and control, one victory was never enough. His gaze soon shifted to another target, one just a few doors away, and more Martin. Anne was an 83-year-old retired headmistress, a devout Catholic, and a woman whose life was largely solitary but rooted in the traditions of her faith. She lived only 2 doors down from Peter's home, making her an accessible target. Like Peter, she was intelligent, articulate, and respected within the community. But she was also vulnerable, lonely, advanced in age, and yearning for companionship. Ben saw in her the same opportunities he had exploited in Peter. Someone he could charm, isolate, and manipulate into leaving him wealth and property. This time, however, his methods would evolve in a disturbing new direction. Where with Peter he had primarily relied on drugs, gaslighting, and the guise of romance, with Anne he took a more spiritual and psychological approach. He understood that Anne's faith was central to her identity, so he wove his manipulation into the fabric of her religious devotion. He visited her often, offering help with errands, companionship, and flattering words. He played the role of a caring young man guided by Christian values. For Anne, his attention was flattering and unexpected. She confided in him, welcomed his presence, and began to see him as a source of comfort in her later years. Then came the extraordinary tactic that revealed both his cunning and his cruelty. Ben began writing messages on mirrors in Anne's home, presenting them as divine revelations. These messages suggested that God wanted her to leave her estate to Ben, framing his manipulation as a holy command. For a woman of strong Catholic faith, these apparent signs carried deep weight. The messages shook her, confused her, and eventually influenced her decisions about her will. What might have seemed preposterous to others became a spiritual dilemma for Anne, who truly believed she might be acting in accordance with divine instruction. Martin Smith, Ben's close friend and co-conspirator, lingered in the background of this manipulation. Though less directly involved than Ben, he shared in the deception, presenting himself as part of the supportive circle around Anne. Together, the two young men projected an image of care and companionship. But behind the smiles and Sunday visits lay the same cold ambition that had ended Peter's life. Yet Anne was not Peter. Though deeply influenced by Ben's psychological tactics, she did not succumb to the same fate. Over time, she confided in relatives and friends about the unusual messages and Ben's growing involvement in her life. Her loved ones began to suspect that something was wrong, that his influence was not as benevolent as it appeared. The alarm bells began to sound, faintly at first, but loud enough that they would eventually catch the attention of authorities. Meanwhile, Ben maintained his double life. To Anne and the church community, he was the attentive helper, a young man guided by compassion and faith. To his accomplice Martin, he was the mastermind of a cruel game, someone who took pleasure in the act of manipulation itself. He even kept diaries in which he recorded his actions and thoughts with chilling detachment. In them, he described Peter's decline, his own success in deceiving others, and his ongoing plans with Anne. The writings were not confessions in the conventional sense, but they revealed a man who saw himself as a puppeteer, orchestrating the fates of those around him. It was through Anne's survival that the facade finally began to crack. Her relatives, alarmed by her stories and suspicious of the unusual changes in her will, raised concerns that eventually reached the police. What began as an inquiry into possible fraud soon widened into a far more complex investigation. Detectives started to piece together a pattern. Two elderly individuals, living in close proximity, both with sudden or unusual changes to their wills, both under the influence of the same young man. The coincidences were too stark to ignore. As police delved deeper, they discovered the extent of Ben's psychological hold over both Peter and Anne. They examined the mirror messages, the altered wills, and the testimony of those who had seen Anne's distress. What truly began to unravel the case, however, was the decision to re-examine the circumstances of Peter Farquhar's death. Though initially recorded as natural, the suspicions around and made investigators question whether Peter's passing had in fact been orchestrated. Peter's body was exhumed, and forensic experts conducted detailed examinations. Though the traces of the drugs used were subtle and difficult to detect after years, the circumstantial evidence was overwhelming when combined with Peter's journals and Ben's own writings. The pattern of drugging, the manipulation of his faith, and the will changes all pointed to something far darker than natural causes. The death that had been mourned quietly in 2015 now stood as the centerpiece of a murder inquiry. As detectives built their case, they uncovered a chilling portrait of Ben Field. To the public, he was articulate, intelligent, and outwardly pious. To those he targeted, he was a source of affection and companionship. But in reality, he was driven by greed, ego, and a perverse thrill in controlling the lives of others. The duality of his character made him both dangerous and convincing. It explained why Peter, a man so wise and experienced, had fallen under his spell, and why Anne, strong in faith and principle, had nearly succumbed as well. Neighbors. The dissonance between appearance and reality was stark, forcing friends and parishioners to question how such evil could have existed unnoticed in their midst. By the time charges were brought, the case had grown into one of the most shocking stories in modern British criminal history. The deaths, wills, and manipulations were not isolated incidents but parts of a broader pattern. Ben Field and Martin Smith had crafted a campaign of deception that blurred the lines between affection and exploitation, faith and fraud, care and cruelty. And though it had survived, Peter's death loomed as a reminder of just how far Ben was willing to go. The stage was set for a trial that would expose the depths of his deceit. Evidence gathered from diaries, journals, forensic analysis, and witness testimonies would reveal the reality of what had transpired behind the closed doors of Maids Moreton. What had begun as whispers of concern around and Moreton would soon explode into a courtroom drama that revisited the quiet death of Peter Farquhar and revealed it for what it truly was: murder. A quiet English village, a beloved teacher, and a charming young theology student. Behind closed doors, a sinister plot was unfolding. What looked like love was actually manipulation, betrayal, and murder. This is the shocking story of Peter Farquhar, and the killer who deceived an entire community. When the trial of Ben Field finally opened, it drew national attention. The story of a theology student who had insinuated himself into the lives of elderly neighbors, exploiting their loneliness and faith for his own gain, resonated as both chilling and unfathomable. The Crown Prosecution Service presented a case that was as complex as it was devastating, weaving together the threads of Peter Farquhar's death and Moreton's manipulation, and the trail of deceit that linked them. At the center of it all was Field himself, calm, articulate, and outwardly pious, yet portrayed by prosecutors as a remorseless manipulator who took pleasure in the suffering of those who trusted him most. The jury listened as Peter's journals were read aloud, words written in his own hand describing his confusion, his growing despair, and his fear that he was losing his mind. They heard how his once sharp intellect had become clouded by the drugs Ben had secretly administered, leaving him vulnerable to suggestion and dependent on his abuser. These writings, combined with medical evidence of his decline, painted a harrowing picture. Prosecutors argued that Peter's death in 2015 was not natural at all, but the result of a deliberate campaign of drugging and psychological torment designed to make him appear frail and delusional. Also, Ben could inherit his wealth. And Moreton's testimony added another layer of horror. She described how she had discovered strange messages on her mirrors, written in what she was led to believe was the hand of God, urging her to change her will in Ben's favor. She spoke of her confusion, her faith shaken, her emotions manipulated by a man she had trusted. She explained how his attention had seemed flattering at first, how she had begun to believe his interest in her was sincere, and how her health had faltered under the pressure of his psychological control. It was only through the concern of her relatives that she had been able to break free of his influence before it was too late. The prosecution also presented Ben's own writings, a series of diaries in which he detailed his thoughts with chilling detachment. He described Peter as a project, someone he could manipulate and observe. He boasted about his ability to deceive, about his pleasure in controlling others. These diary entries removed any doubt about his intentions. They were not the words of a man in love, nor of a misguided carer. They were the confessions of a predator who saw his victims as experiments. Martin Smith, Ben's accomplice, also faced trial. His role, while not as direct in the poisoning and psychological abuse, was nevertheless central in the broader conspiracy. He had shared in the plans, offered support, and benefited from the deception. While Smith portrayed himself as a peripheral figure, the prosecution argued that his involvement was far from innocent. The jury had to decide whether his actions made him equally culpable for murder or whether his guilt was limited to fraud. The defense attempted to humanize Ben, portraying him as a troubled young man whose relationships with older individuals were rooted in a genuine search for companionship. They suggested that Peter's death had indeed been natural, that his drinking and health issues were sufficient explanation. They argued that the diaries were exaggerated reflections of a disturbed mind rather than blueprints for murder. But as the evidence accumulated, the weight of the prosecution's case grew impossible to dismiss. Witness after witness spoke of Peter's character, his strength of mind, and his devotion to his faith and teaching. They recalled how his decline had been sudden and out of character, how his once vibrant personality had withered in the final years of his life. They spoke of Anne's distress, her confusion, and her gratitude when she was finally able to escape Ben's control. The contrast between the man Ben had pretended to be, a dutiful partner, a kind neighbor, a Christian companion, and the reality of his actions could not have been sharper. After weeks of testimony, the jury returned with its verdict. Ben Field was convicted of the murder of Peter Farquhar, as well as fraud and attempted fraud relating to and more Martin. He was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 36 years, a punishment that reflected both the severity of his crimes and the danger he posed to society. Martin Smith was acquitted of murder but convicted of fraud, his role recognized but distinguished from Ben's. The outcome brought a measure of justice, but it also left a community shaken. The people of Maids Moreton, who had welcomed Ben into their homes, their church, and their lives, struggled to reconcile the image of the caring young man they thought they knew with the manipulative killer revealed in court. For Peter's family and former students, the verdict was both a relief and a source of profound sadness. Justice had been done, but it could not bring back the man whose life had been stolen in such a cruel and calculated way. The case also raised wider questions about vulnerability, trust, and the ways in which predators exploit those who are isolated or in need of companionship. It highlighted the dangers of assuming that abuse always leaves visible marks, showing instead how psychological control and subtle manipulation can be just as devastating as physical violence. It became a cautionary tale, a reminder that evil can sometimes wear the mask of devotion and that trust, once broken, can leave wounds that never fully heal. In the end, the story of Peter Farquhar was not only the story of a murder but also of resilience. Through his diaries, his voice endured, ensuring that the truth of what had been done to him was heard. Through survival and testimony, the web of deceit was exposed before it could claim another life. And through the tireless work of investigators and prosecutors, justice was finally achieved. The trial closed a chapter in Maids Moreton, but the legacy of the case continues to echo. Peter Farquhar is remembered not as a victim defined by his final years, but as the teacher, writer, and man of faith who inspired countless lives. His story, though tragic, became a testament to the strength of truth over deception, of memory over manipulation, and of justice over cruelty.